Yeah, we were talking beforehand, and Attila mentioned to me that James Connolly is not that well known of in Hungary. I can't do Connolly justice in 15 minutes, but maybe some of you will be inspired enough by the nonsense I talked today to go away and find out some things for yourselves. What I wanted to do was, is the screen being shared?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, I should have asked. What I want to do is focus on a narrow but very important part of revolutionary strategy, focusing on three documents, one by Connolly, one by Lenin, and another by the Comintern. It's a report by Lenin, but of the debates and discussions at the Comintern, and it's about what really you're aiming for in revolution. You know, what are the tasks, the objective tasks in front of you in relation to revolution, which are not always the same everywhere by any means, and how do you aim to achieve that, and what are the alliances necessary to achieve that, by which I mean primarily the class alliances. The three documents are Connolly's Nationalism and Socialism, written in 1897, Lenin, a very short extract from Two Tactics of Social Democracy in a Democratic Revolution in 1905, and then Lenin's report of the Commission on the National and Colonial Questions at the Comintern in 1920. And I apologize to those of you for whom all these are very familiar documents, but in my view, they're rarely combined in a way that I think is illuminating enough. And it's not dependent on me, but trying to tease out what these leaders and organization were trying to arrive at. I should say, in relation to all three, that insofar as they're each widely known in our movement amongst Marxists and socialists, they're generally, I find, quite abused. And I'll go on to how they're abused and bowdlerized and distorted, because I think we need to obviously overthrow those distortions and bowdlerizations and reinstate a correct understanding, or a more simply logical and materialist understanding of what they were trying to achieve. Okay, turning now to the first document, I'll start with the bowdlerization and distortion, if I may, because this is probably one of the most distorted and bowdlerized documents in the Anglophone Marxist world. Because there's a section in Nationalism and Socialism where Connolly says that if all you do is hoist a green flag over Dublin Castle — Dublin Castle was the centre of British military colonial rule in Ireland — and all you do is paint the post boxes green, you would have achieved nothing, because England will still rule you by her banks. This is a warning about what nationalism, how it can get diverted and what it's supposed to achieve. However, that section of the paper is the most, or his popular article, as it was in his newspaper, is extremely, that's the one that's focused on, and even that they leave off the bit about the English banks. So what is generally said is that James Connolly argued that it's no good just hoisting a green flag over Dublin Castle and painting the post boxes green, you've achieved nothing, as if to say that Connolly thought nationalism was a waste of time. And actually it's explicitly cast in those terms, that nationalism in an oppressed or colonial country is a waste of time. There was recently an article in a left-wing newspaper here which misquoted it again in the traditional fashion, implied that that was something in common of Welsh and Scottish nationalism too. And lo and behold, the only respectable nationalism for English socialists is English nationalism. So that's how far things have gone sometimes. So I wanted to actually quote one of the opening pieces of the article. And it's the first is to say who it's addressed to. So I've highlighted the fact that it's actually addressed into what Connolly calls earnest nationalists, i.e. it's not addressed to people who are already convinced of the need for socialism and people who are against nationalism. On the contrary, it's addressed to people who are in favour of nationalism. And then he talks about what type of republic, because it was a given amongst Irish nationalists of all stripes that what they wanted was a republic and to overthrow and expel the British Empire. He says that he doesn't want a republic as in France, which is he calls a capitalist monarchy which parodies the constitutional abortion of England. And he doesn't want the more democratic republic of the United States, where the power of the purse has established a new tyranny. What he wants, and he goes on to the end, is to create a republic which has its point of departure socialism. And then in the other section I've highlighted, he talks about the alliances that are necessary: the tenant farmer, the worker, the wage labourer on the land. So that's his class alliances. His class alliances to achieve the republic which could have as its starting point socialism are clearly the proletariat, the agricultural proletariat, and the peasantry, and particularly the tenant farmer, because in Ireland at the time, very many large estates were owned by very wealthy landowners, many of whom were English or owed their allegiance to England. So that's quite a clear exposition in a very popular way of what he's talking about. He's talking about it's addressed to nationalists. His alliances are the wage slaves, the agricultural labourers, the petty bourgeoisie. And his aim is not a democratic republic of these various European types or even of the apparently more democratic type in the US. It's the point of departure is socialism. Okay, that's the first thing. This is from Lenin, and it's quite. I find it quite. It's something I like about reading Lenin, because this is actually a footnote. And what Lenin does, he never talks down to his readers. So this is a footnote, not because it's unimportant. It's because he's saying, well, this is sort of given. You all know this really, but this is just a reminder. And that's why it's a footnote in Lenin. And what here Lenin was talking about was the overthrow of the autocracy, feudalism, and serfdom. So not wholly unlike the colonial oppression that Connolly was talking about. And he says that, and I think this is quite important, that there are three classes who want to get rid of the autocracy. That's the liberal bourgeoisie, the radical petty bourgeoisie, and the proletariat. And if it looks familiar in terms of what we've just read from Connolly, it very much is. But he says that there are three banners that these three different forces will have in the coming revolution. The revolution was taken as a given. The first is that the liberal bourgeoisie will only fight for a constitutional monarchy. That's what Connolly referred to as the constitutional abortion of England, or something more like France. The radical petty bourgeoisie will fight for a democratic republic, and that's the model for that in everyone's mind was the United States. And the third necessarily will fight for socialist revolution. And he goes on to talk about confusion, confusing one with the other. Now, Lenin's text has been widely distorted too, and not least by people who call themselves Marxists or Leninists, who themselves introduce confusion. because this is in a pamphlet, as is shown, that the title of which is "The Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution." So why the hell is Lenin talking about socialist revolution and democratic revolution as not the same thing and carried out by two different classes? And what is the nature of the argument he's making in relation to the class alliances? And this seems to have confused people who would like to follow Lenin or believe they are following Lenin for generations. Because as we know, Lenin used lots of formulas like revolutionary democratic dictatorship, dictatorship of the peasantry, the proletariat, and a number of other formulations, including in this pamphlet. And yet the pamphlet is supposed to be about the democratic revolution. And actually, in my view, the confusion is introduced by the readers of Lenin, not the author himself. Because what Lenin was at pains to point out was, firstly, that the liberal bourgeoisie would not carry through the revolution. The clear conclusion of 1848 across Europe, where Russia had played the general role of the executor of the revolution and sometimes the revolutionaries, or executioners, I should say, is that the liberal bourgeoisie would need to rely on the revolutionary masses to overthrow autocracy, but that once they stirred the revolutionary potential of those masses, they would run scared. They would run scared that the movement would run beyond them. So they were incapable. So Lenin argues that it's beyond the capacity of the liberal bourgeoisie to lead the revolution. And therefore, it must be reliant on the second two classes, of which, of course, in Russia, as is the case in very many countries, not just in Eastern Europe, but Ireland being one of them, where the peasantry was far more numerous than the proletariat. And what Lenin insists on, and insisted on all through, right up to the April Theses and the October Revolution itself, is that it was impossible to tell in advance what the exact relationship was between those two classes, the proletariat and the peasantry, which one would lead and which one would therefore set the agenda in terms of the strategy and aims and the limits of the revolution. And he insisted, against all critics, that that was the formula in terms of the class alliance. The class alliance determined what was objectively possible in the course of the revolution, and that no one could know in advance which one would have the upper hand of those two revolutionary classes. And of course, as he was often fond of quoting Goethe himself, it turned out that theory, my friend, it was indeed grey, and life is much more eternally green. And so what happened in 1917 was two revolutions, which no one had foreseen. But that's a story for another day. But that was the nature of the class alliances that were necessary. And when it was objected later, i.e. in the course of 1917, that Lenin had changed his mind, that wasn't the case. What actually happened is, in the concrete struggle, it had become clear that prior to October, but after February, that it was going to be necessary for the proletariat to lead the revolution. And that would itself then determine the character of the revolution, i.e. a socialist revolution, which relied on support from the radical and revolutionary petty bourgeoisie. We can put it this way, is that what Lenin did was he outlined the algebra for revolutions, and the Russian example was a specific arithmetic form of that, about what came first and what came second. Whereas other revolutions, notably the Chinese Revolution, operated under the same algebra but with different arithmetic, i.e. it was the peasantry which had played the dominant role, but under the leadership of the Communist Party. That's a debate or discussion for a much later date. So I will just move on to the penultimate slide. And this is Lenin's report of the deliberation at the Comintern, Second Congress of the Comintern in 1920 on the national and colonial question. Many people will be familiar with this. There's a big debate with an Indian communist, M.N. Roy, who had made some very telling points about the role of the bourgeoisie in the oppressed countries. And bear in mind, this ultimately led to the revision of Marx and Engels' slogan that workers of the world unite. This ultimately led to workers of the world and oppressed countries unite. This is how big a discussion this was. So the pieces I've highlighted, and again, I'd encourage everyone to go back and study and restudy these. I'm sure many of you have already. But is the points about, firstly, that the character of the revolution in the underdeveloped countries, economically underdeveloped countries, was a bourgeois democratic one. Lenin argues, and resting on what was by then the consensus in the Comintern, that the character of the revolutions was determined by the social forces available in the given countries, and that the fact that the overwhelming mass of the population in these underdeveloped countries consists of peasants who represent bourgeois capitalist relationships. However, it was then argued, especially vociferously by M.N. Roy, that in the oppressed countries, in the backward countries, there was what Lenin calls somewhat politely a rapprochement between the bourgeoisie of the exploiting countries and those of the colonies. And so that very often the first became a puppet of the other, and certainly was not a factor in the revolutionary movement. And as a result, they changed the characterization of the revolutions in those countries from bourgeois democratic to national revolutionary. And again, this became a major factor in subsequent revolutions, and the idea that you could, under certain circumstances, while not having any faith in the national bourgeoisie as a whole, it may be possible that certain sections of the national bourgeoisie play some, if not a leading role, in the revolution itself. Okay, so that's those three documents taken together, I think, show one, a continuity in terms of the thinking of the communists and Marxists, and two, a really concretely determined development of those ideas in relation to or in response to the. Sorry, am I being told I'm time up? I don't know.
You have 2 minutes, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Sorry,
background noise. Just a second, there's a background noise, and I think this is the interpreters. No, I mute them.
Yeah. Okay.
Just a second. No, still.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah.
So that both a continuity and a development, and a radical development. Lenin, in his opening this report, called it the cardinal question of the Congress, and that it led to a significant evolution in both the theory and practice of revolution. And it's one that has informed subsequent revolutions, whether that's directly, as in China and Vietnam in particular, or whether that's indirectly, as in relation to Cuba. It's something that's part of our heritage that we need to develop. We need to sort of rediscover in some senses, and also an appeal for things like, well, actually, the Russian revolutionaries in particular spent a great deal of time studying the French Revolution, and it's very clear that the class categorizations that Connolly, that Lenin, and the Comintern are able to use with great facility is an aid to understanding the revolutionary process. So I think there should be an appeal to reinstitute that as far as possible in the that are discussions, debates, and narratives about revolution. And then finally, I just want to show that this is a living legacy. I was actually up in Edinburgh recently, outside where Connolly was born. And the one of the local trades councils, because it was strangely no pre-planning on my part. Strangely, one of his I was there on the day of his birthday, and one of the trades councils had placed a birthday card and flowers in his honor. This is a living legacy. It's regarded by the workers' movement. This is a Durham miners banner. And we should be the ones leading the rediscovery, reinvigoration, and increasing use of the theoretical gains made by these leaders and our organizations. That's it from me.